If everyone could please find a seat, we'll get the program started in just a moment. If everyone could please find their seat. Good evening. Good evening. Thank you. Good evening. I'm John Miko. I'm the Executive Director of the Union League Legacy Foundation. It's my pleasure to welcome you tonight to the second of this year's Jack M. Templeton Liberty Series programs. The Jack Templeton Liberty Series was, of course, named for Jack Templeton. Many of you knew Jack. Jack passed a few years ago. His wife, Pina, who many of you also know or knew, made the gift that made possible this series. And she named it in honor of Jack just about 2 years ago. And probably most of you know that Pina, after a long illness, passed about 2 weeks ago. And I wanted to just take a moment to acknowledge Pina, to acknowledge the impact she has made on the Union League, on the Legacy Foundation, and for being the visionary that funded this great program. So if we'll just take a moment to remember Pina in silence. Thank you. Tonight's program is presented by the Union League Legacy Foundation. The Legacy Foundation is the charitable organization of the Union League of Philadelphia. We use the values, the history, the collections of this great institution for programs like the Liberty Series, Good Citizen Day, for college scholarships for good citizens, for exhibits, and programs that inspire members of the Union League and our community. We hope, and you are doing this today, that if you share these values, you'll attend our programs. More importantly, if you don't share our values, attend these programs. Right, Professor Kors? We are funded not through dues, not through the Union League itself, but through voluntary contributions mostly from Union League members. So to everyone tonight who is a donor, I know many of you are, I thank you. If you are not, I encourage you to make a contribution to the Legacy Foundation, to your legacy. If you don't know how to do that, and then we're making it easier and easier, you should receive a mailing if you're a member, if you haven't already in the last few days. Please see me or Joan or Kira or John Serlin, who's the chair of our development effort. There's John. And join those who support this great institution and this great charity, the Union League Legacy Foundation. So a few housekeeping items. First of all, if you would please take a moment to silence your cell phones. We would appreciate that. Tonight's program will run 45 or 50 minutes. We'll have Q&A following Professor Kaur's presentation. I remind you that questions should be 2 or 3 sentences. And if you cannot put a question mark at the end of those sentences, you have failed. We will moderate that through a microphone, so please use the microphones because we are taping, and we'll need that for the audio, so please, we'll bring the mic to you. Please use the microphone. And finally, it's my pleasure to introduce to you the chair of the Legacy Foundation, Joan Carter, who will introduce tonight's speaker. Joan.
Good evening. It is really my pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, and I know you've heard me say that a lot of times, but this time I really mean it. So, Dr. Alan Charles Kors, I met, I don't know, maybe 10 or 12 years ago through Cyril and Howard Magan, and I had read something that he'd written, and it was so impressive to me. And she mentioned that she knew him. I said, oh, Cyril, can you get me an introduction? So that's how I met him. So Professor Kors is a professor emeritus of history at the University of Pennsylvania, where he taught the intellectual history of the 17th and 18th century. He's a widely respected teacher, has received both the Lindback Foundation Award and the Ira Abrams Memorial Award for distinguished college teaching. He's published extensively on the conceptual revolutions of the 17th and 18th century and has produced 3 taped series on the period for the Teaching Company. In addition, he was editor-in-chief of the Oxford Encyclopedia of the Enlightenment. So throughout his career, Professor Kors has been a fearless advocate for individual freedom and for academic freedom. In 1993, he defended Eden Jacobowitz in the infamous or famous, whatever you want to call it, water buffalo case. And that led to the writing of the Shadow University and then to the founding of FIRE, which stands for the Foundation for Independent Rights in Education, which is a wonderful organization that promotes free speech on campus. Professor Kors was elected 5 times to the university and school committees on academic freedom and responsibilities by his colleagues. And he's also written and lectured widely on the assault on liberty and freedom of conscience on America's campuses. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Alan Charles Kors.
Thank you. It's a great privilege to be here. I shall speak tonight, as promised, on the victims of socialism. In the wake of the Holocaust and the Nazi ruins, anti-Semitism lay low just a bit, shamed by the actual exercise of state dominion. In the wake of the collapse of Soviet and East European communism, coercive socialism, too, lay low for just a moment. That moment has passed. Socialism's appeal and route to power always have been there in the convergence of liberal free enterprise and political democracy. The former creates wealth that has transformed all human possibility, but gives rise to deep envy. The latter allows ambition, a democratic route to seize and redistribute wealth. Indeed, the bounty of free enterprise leads the politicians and our intellectuals to believe that such wealth is a fact of nature, there for the taking, as if it would be produced in equal quantity and quality in any system. Communism is consequential socialism. That is, socialism with actual coercive power. Socialism sought the abolition of private property, profit, and voluntary exchange, and the socialist Bolsheviks had the control to pursue that vision. It meant central planners who allegedly knew what people needed and how to satisfy those needs. Socialism is easily understood by any child. It is taking other people's stuff. It is the slaughter of the goose that lays the golden eggs. That folk tale is enduring precisely because it reflects something deep in human nature. To end the appeal of socialism in this or that form, one would have to eliminate envy, coercion, and political ambition from our affairs. That would be a different world. The passionate millennial faith of 19th century socialism perhaps no longer moves masses or leaders, but its underlying impulses and values remain potent. Politicians and demagogues appeal successfully against property, profit, economic liberty, and the market. Socialism is a positive, not a negative term for millennials. To believe that the future will be less susceptible to demagoguery, envy, and the myth of planning would be a foolish act of faith. It is by no means clear to whom the future belongs. In 1951, the political economist Ludwig von Mises warned us not to confuse the competition among various statists with the deeper ideological conflict of our age, the struggle between supporters of a market economy and supporters of, in Mises's phrase, totalitarian government control. Mises was wrong historically to minimize in any way the singular evil of the Bolsheviks. In the long run, however, he was right that freedom ultimately depended on the outcome of the struggle between private property, voluntary production, and voluntary exchange on the one hand, and central planning on the other. There is a reality independent of human whim, and no governmental schemes or grand designs can alter that central fact of human existence. Individual freedom, we learn from that reality, is the great catalyst of human well-being and progress. One may design all the utopias and build all the gulags in the world, but the consequences of the reality principle play themselves out regardless, although the suffering caused by those designs and those camps is virtually immeasurable. The schemes cannot change natural consequences, and we are part of that nature. Men and women with economic, political, social, and intellectual freedom live not only freer lives, but lives of hope, bounty, social cooperation, opportunity, and mobility within society. One may defend such freedom, of course, purely on the basis of rights, but note well that tyranny ultimately leads not only to a denial of what makes us human beings capable of morality, but also to deprivation and to misery. There are decisions that are made for us by others, whether emperors, commissars, bureaucrats, or democratic majorities. And there are decisions that we as individuals make for ourselves. Individual freedom is the right to frame one's life and vocation according to one's own choices, knowledge, and values, and to enjoy the rewards and also bear the costs of one's own choices. A free society is one where such individual freedom flourishes under the rule of law as opposed to the capricious whims and schemes of men and women in authority. A society in which legal equality, security in one's life and the fruits of one's labor and risk, due process, and freedom of speech and conscience are every individual's birthright. Individual freedom gives us moral dignity and has given us, to an extent that no one could have dreamed possible, the means to harmonize the activities of disparate actors towards human satisfaction. Societies based on individual freedom have produced both the greatest liberation from want, ignorance, and superstition, and the greatest increase of bounty and opportunity in all of human history. The great Friedrich Hayek and Ludwig von Mises were at one in believing that socialism, central planning, had an ultimately totalizing logic. Both of them understood, in contrast to almost all of their intellectual contemporaries, that the more complex a society and economy, the more impossible and incoherent the task of central planning became. Without the price mechanism to reflect the choices of individuals, there was no efficacious way to discover and allocate economic knowledge or to harmonize the activities of diverse actors toward human satisfaction. More deeply, both understood that central planning placed us, in Hayek's phrase, on the road to serfdom. In the late 1920s, communists began to distinguish analytically between socialism and communism. Departing from Marx, who appeared to use the words interchangeably, communists argued that socialism was a transitional stage between capitalism and a final communism. In essence, Hayek's Road to Serfdom, published in 1944, was a sustained argument that indeed even democratic socialism could only be an ineluctable transition toward the almost total abolition of economic, intellectual, and moral liberty. At the heart of this argument lay Hayek's chilling, inductively correct, and prescient chapter, Why the Worst Get on Top. It was no accident of time or place that the concentration of power over all of human life in a centrally planned society attracted and rewarded the aggressive, unscrupulous, and demagogic who would attract around them the simultaneously submissive and ruthless. Central planning would bring forth leaders who took power not as a necessary evil, but as an end in itself. Economic power over the whole life of other persons, Hayek judged, centralized as political power, created a society of slave masters and virtual slaves, in which a leader's decisions about the good of the whole overrode all individualist ethics and law. Those limited by ethical prohibitions would flee power and those literally capable of anything would rise to high positions under a ruler whose primary passion in life was to be obeyed. Hayek made a moral as well as a utilitarian case for a society of economic freedom. In The Road to Serfdom, he wrote, quote, "Freedom to order our own conduct in the sphere where material circumstances force a choice upon us, and responsibility for the arrangement of our own life according to our own conscience is the air in which alone moral sense grows and in which moral values are daily created in the free decision of the individual. Responsibility not to a superior, but to one's own conscience, the awareness of duties not exacted by compulsion, the necessity to decide which of the things one values are to be sacrificed to others and to bear the consequences of one's decision are the very essence of any morals which deserve the name." Close quote. Hayek's analysis never has been the view of political Europe or of intellectual America. The collapse of the Eastern European communist regimes has not entailed and will not entail disillusionment with the substance of socialism under other names until the latter socialism is linked to the catastrophic experience of the former. This has not occurred. For point of reference, the first wave of significant disillusionment that swept across Europe and the West in the 1930s in response to Stalinism was that it had failed to accomplish the Bolshevik dream. By contrast, in the case of Nazism, there were no significant works that spoke of disillusionment because National Socialism had failed to fulfill the ideals of tribalism, exclusive and expansive nationalism, the corporate state, and the Führer principle. George Orwell's ineffable 1984 touched on the personal liberty of the private soul, but not on the economic liberty that had been its greatest friend. The final tragedy of Animal Farm was that the leadership of the revolution had become just like the bourgeoisie. Arthur Koestler's searing Darkness at Noon still dreamed of a future in which an absolute ethics would be joined to the socialist struggle against economic fatality. In 1949, a book was published, The God That Failed, that has been the best-selling anti-communist work in America since its publication. Every essay in that book concluded with a rejection of an economically free society of voluntary, uncoerced exchanges. The disillusionment was that socialism had not been fully realized in Stalin's Russia. The poet Stephen Spender concluded his essay by saying that without socialization of the means of production, the world remained, quote, a mass of automatic economic contradictions. No criticism of the communists, he wrote, removes the arguments against capitalism. And, quote, America, the greatest capitalist country, seems to offer no alternatives to war, exploitation, and the destruction of the world's resources. That was the most celebrated anti-communist book of the post-war period, and it was subsidized by the CIA. The Marxists themselves, ironically, always asked that forms of human society be judged not by their abstract ideals, but by their actual living incarnations. Let us do that now. The goal of socialism was, by abolishing private property and free markets, to end human tyranny and to reap the economic, cultural, scientific, and creative rewards of such a communalization of life. Communism, with command of the state, sought to create that socialist society. What occurred, in fact? Above all else, there are the bodies. One cannot discuss the past, present, or future while they lie there unacknowledged. We are surrounded by slain innocents, and the scale is wholly new. Of so few works of scholarship may one say that its documentation and rigor are indispensable to honest debate in one's time. The editors of, you only have to remember the title, The Black Book of Communism, Crimes, Terror, Repression, translated into English and published by Harvard University Press in 1999, is such a work. The best scholars address the costs and death tolls of every communist regime. It is largely unread and most certainly unread in university curricula. What do we know about the communist slaughter? This is not the thousands of the Inquisition. It is not the thousands of American lynching. This is not the 6 million dead from Nazi extermination. The best scholarship yields numbers that the mind must try to comprehend. Scores and scores and scores and scores of millions of bodies, all around us. Martin Malia, Berkeley's late Soviet specialist in The Soviet Tragedy, with only a partial view of the archives, posited 20 million dead. Anton Antonov-Ovseyenko consulted with the historians who had studied the problem for Khrushchev, who then kept the numbers secret. And he claimed that at least 50 million had died, excluding the victims of the Civil War and World War II. Most compellingly of all, Alexander Yakovlev, Y-A-K-O-V-L-E-V, the architect of perestroika, Gorbachev's right-hand man, entered the archives on behalf of the last Soviet leader and wrote in his book, A Century of Violence in Soviet Russia, truly a must-read, that 60 million human beings were slain in the Soviet Union alone. For the remainder of his life, he regretted and bore witness against what had been until then his lifetime commitment to communism. The brilliant Chinese author Zheng Chang, with her historian husband John Halliday, had access to scores of Mao Zedong's closest friends and collaborators, and she benefited from the temporary opening of the Russian archives. The Russians had kept the most detailed tabs on Mao. In their stunning book, Mao, The Unknown Story, they reached the figure of 70 million individual human lives snuffed out by Mao's deliberate choices. If we count those dead of starvation from the communists' ability to experiment with human interactions in agriculture, 20 million to 40 million in 3 years in China alone. We may add scores of millions more. Shot, dead by deliberate exposure, starved, murdered in work camps and prisons meant to extract every last fiber of labor and then kill them. And widows, and widowers, and orphans. No cause ever in the history of all mankind has produced more slaughtered innocents and more orphans than socialism with power. It surpassed exponentially all other systems of production in turning out the dead. They are all around us. No one talks about them. No one honors them. No one does penance for them. No one has committed self-harm for having been an apologist for those who did this to them. No one pays for them. No one is hunted down to account for them. It is exactly what Solzhenitsyn foresaw in the Gulag archipelago. No one would have to answer. No one would be looked into. Close quote. The West accepts an epical, monstrous, unforgivable double standard. We rehearse the crimes of Nazism almost daily. We teach them to our children as ultimate historical and moral lessons, and we bear witness to every victim. We are almost silent on the crimes of communism. So the bodies lie among us, unnoticed, everywhere. We insisted rightly upon denazification. There never was nor will be a similar decommunization, though the slaughter of innocents was exponentially greater, and though those who signed the orders and ran the camps remain. In the case of Nazism, we hunt down 95-year-old men because the bones cry out for justice. Rightly so. In the case of communism, however, we insisted no more witch hunts, as the New York Times editorially demanded when Lithuania in the early 90s thought about accountability. Let the dead bury the dead, but these dead can bury no one. The communist Holocaust, like the Nazi, should have brought forth a flowering of Western art and witness and sympathy and an ocean of tears. Instead, it has called forth a glacier of indifference. Kids who in the 1960s had portraits of Mao and Che on their college walls, the moral equivalent of having hung portraits of Hitler, Goebbels, or Himmler, now teach children, our children, to imitate their prior generation. Every historical textbook lingers on the crimes of Nazism, seeks their root causes, draws a lesson from them, and everyone knows the number 6 million. Rightly so. By contrast, it is always the mistakes of communism, repeated by mistake again and again and again and again. Ask college freshmen, ask your own children and grandchildren, how many died under Stalin's regime? And these products of American K through 12 education and college education will answer even now. Thousands? Tens of thousands? I've had that conversation 100 times. What does that mean? It is the equivalent of believing that Hitler killed hundreds of Jews. The scandal of such ignorance derives from an intellectual culture's willful blindness to the catastrophe of its double standards and underlying sympathies. Most of Europe outlawed the neo-Nazis, but the French Communist Party from 1999 to 2002 was part of a ruling government. One may not fly the swastika in Europe, but one may hoist the hammer and sickle at official and unofficial events. The denial of Hitler's dead or the minimization of Hitler's Holocaust is literally a crime in most of Europe. The denial or minimization of communist crimes is an intellectual and political art form and a good route to a chaired professorship. Even in the US, of course, just ask Angela Davis. The Khmer Rouge enslaved a nation and slaughtered a fifth to a fourth of the entire Cambodian population, as if an American regime had murdered some 56 to 70 million of its people. Anti-fascist is a term of honor, nonetheless, where anti-communist is a term of ridicule and abuse. So the dead lie among us, ignored, and anyone with moral eyes must see them, spilling naked out of the television and movie screens, frozen in pain in our classrooms, and sprawled, unacknowledged and unburied across our politics and our culture. Socialism with the actual power and means to plan a society, to abolish private property, and to assault economic inequality and the allocation of capital and goods by free markets, culminated in the crushing of individual economic, religious, associational, and political liberty. Its collectivization of agriculture led to untold suffering, scarcity, and injustice. At its most productive, through fear and slave labor, it built its factories and mines, but without the good stuff and without even the ability to maintain them. Communism in power produced, indeed, scarcity, murderous inefficiency, arbitrary inequality, cronyism, enslavement, concentration camps, torture, terror, the destruction of civil society, ecological disaster, brutal secret police, and systemic tyranny. Everywhere it ruled, there were, beyond our ability to comprehend their courage, those who endured solitary confinement, sleep deprivation, the sadistic infliction of pain, and slow or rapid death because they said no, or because they criticized, or because they would not denounce their friends and colleagues, or simply because they annoyed, for whatever reason, even a joke, a communist with power. To be moral beings, we must acknowledge, come to terms with, and bear witness to these things. It will not happen. The pathology of Western intellectuals has committed them to an adversarial relationship to the very culture that has produced both the greatest liberation from want, ignorance, and superstition, and the greatest increase of human well-being in all of history. No one has explained the origin and development of that pathology adequately, although it constitutes one of the deepest flaws and tragedies of our society. It is a pathology that with each passing decade becomes ever coarser and ever more detached from any principle of reality. That pathology allows Western intellectuals to step around the Everest of bodies of the victims of communism without a tear, an act of contrition, or a reevaluation of self, soul, and mind. For them, the victims of communism are mere abstractions. Faced with the accomplishments of their own society, however, Western intellectuals have the sensitivities of the princess and the pea. In the midst of unparalleled social mobility, they cry, caste system. In a society of unparalleled bounty, they cry, depending on the moment of the business cycle, either poverty or consumerism. In a culture of ever more varied, self-defined, and satisfying lives, they cry alienation. In a society that has liberated women, racial minorities, religious minorities, and sexual minorities to an extent that no one could have dreamed possible just 50 years ago, they cry oppression. In a civilization of boundless private charity, they cry avarice. In an economy in which hundreds of millions have benefited so richly from the risk, the knowledge, and the capital of others, they cry exploitation. In a society that broke on behalf of merit the seemingly eternal chains of station by birth, they cry injustice. The chasm between what central planning and a voluntary society brought us should be the most studied phenomenon of our times. One looks in vain for such study in our research textbooks, schools, and universities. Economists who might explain such things rarely trouble themselves to do economic history, and historians who do the so-called economic and social history of capitalism still teach the world's greatest liberation and enhancement of life as the history of repression, regimentation, degradation, and waste. The humanities in general have become schools of oppression studies in the very societies that have liberated humankind. For almost 50 years, America sacrificed its wealth and at times the lives of its young to contain armed communism, socialism with actual power, sustaining its will and its great burden of debt even when its artists, college students, professors, authors, and filmmakers turned against the alleged folly of such efforts. This was the burden it chose to bear, and then, unexpected by almost all, the fatal weaknesses of tyranny, central planning, and illiberalism in the face of anti-communist political resolve were actualized in the collapse of European communism. Would the West now assess what it fought to preserve and what it fought to protect? What might an optimist have expected? An anti-communist epiphany, a festival of celebration, a flowering of comparative scholarship, a full accounting of the communist reality, political, economic, moral, ecological, social, and cultural, a revision of curriculum, a recognition of the ineffable value of truly limited government and the voluntary exchange. Where did these occur? Imagine if World War II had ended in a stalemate, with a European Nazi army from the Urals to the English Channel, soon armed with nuclear weapons, run even by some technocrat like Speer, in mortal contest with the United States in a peace kept only by nuclear deterrence. Would progressive children have sung, "All we are saying is give peace a chance," beneath the symbol of unilateral disarmament that has come to be called the peace symbol? Would our intellectuals have mocked Reagan's phrase, "the evil empire," if applied to the Third Reich? What were the differences, however? Deaths? Camps? The desolation of the flesh and of the spirit? The bodies will not be buried without an answer to that. Are historians teaching their students any differently about the human consequences of free markets in a real world of comparative phenomena? Indeed, how extraordinary that we do not have an intellectual, moral, and above all, historical accounting of who was right and wrong and why in their analyses of socialism and of socialism in power. We live in an era of appalling bad faith. Our children do not know what happened in any domain under communism in power. The strength of even relatively free enterprise and even relatively limited government makes it likely to ensure that our civilization lives on, but it does so without self-belief and without moral understanding of its place in the drama of human life, and without accounting for the scores of millions of dead and for the societies and beliefs that butchered them. You put private property ahead of people remains a potent malediction, as if private property were not absolutely essential to the well-being, dignity, liberty, and lives of those people. You put profits ahead of people, as if profits were not the measure of other people's satisfactions of want and desire. Indeed, it is precisely to avoid the revivification of classical liberal principles that our teachers, professors, information media, and filmmakers ignore the comparative inquiry that the time so urgently demands. And our children do not know. They do not know about the bodies. They do not know how and why those bodies came to be. And as for the mea culpas, we await them in vain. When Eisenhower heard that the German residents of the city of Goethe didn't know about Ohrdruf, a death camp whose stench should have reached their nostrils, he marched every single one of them through the rotting corpses. The mayor of Goethe and his wife went home and hanged themselves. Ike commanded Generals Patton and Bradley to tour Ohrdruf and Buchenwald with him, announcing that such crimes were, quote, beyond the American mind to comprehend, close. We lack his authority. Milan Kundera, the great Czech novelist, stated the moral reality with clarity. What about Czech communists with good intentions, he asked in The Unbearable Lightness of Being. He wrote, quote, when Oedipus realized that he himself was the cause of their suffering, he put out his own eyes and wandered blind away from Thebes. unable to stand the sight of the misfortunes he had wrought by not knowing, he put out his eyes and wandered blind away from Thebes. To conclude, let the apologists for communism, which is socialism with consequential power, acknowledge the dead, bury the dead, and atone for the dead. Otherwise, in my book, let them be forgiven only when they indeed have put out their eyes and wandered blind away from Thebes. Let Western intellectuals learn the words of Requiem, written during the Stalinist terror by Anna Akhmatova, the greatest Russian poet of the 20th century. Quote, I will remember them always and everywhere. I will never forget. I will never forget them no matter what comes. Close quote. The bodies demand accounting, apology, and repentance. Without such things, the age of communism and the safe appeal of socialism lives. Without such things, the fate of liberty is perilous. Thank you very much.
Thank you, for
That is
Professor.
not my response on a college campus.
Well, I'm happy that it's the response tonight, Professor. Questions for Professor Coors?
Thank you. Professor, I'd like to ask you to introduce us to 3 American citizens who all emigrated from Middle European countries after World War II. And you answered my other question about how are you doing it, our precious pen. But anyway, keep going. The 3 people I'd like you to just briefly tell us about and their impact on our political system today are Saul Alinsky, author of Roadmap for Radicals, Mr. Gorbachev, who is enjoying his time in San Francisco, but we never hear him speak, and he's so repentant, as you said. I'd love to hear him go into our high schools and on speaking tours. I don't know what he's doing. And lastly, Mr. Soros, who funded the election campaign of our DA Krasner in Philadelphia and is doing the same thing at other cities throughout the country. What are their impacts for us in the future of our political system? Thank you.
One of the things that one can't silence and one doesn't want, right? To silence
Professor.
anyone or their disciples. What is? Oh, yeah. One doesn't want, obviously, to silence anyone or their disciples making arguments, giving voluntarily. What is so sadly lacking and never encouraged by our media are the voices of those who lived not Soros's Hungary, the Hungarian uprising, and found freedom here. What is needed are those who escaped from Russia, Eastern Europe, China, North Korea, speaking here at our universities, right? Ironically, one of the great historians of the crimes of Mao, brilliant Chinese historian, Frank de Cutter, he didn't get a position at American University. He's teaching, you'll see why I said ironically, at the University of Hong Kong. But the desperate need that we have for voices from that East European experience and Asian communist experience to be counter voices to the disciples of Alinsky, to the Soroses, it's a desperate need. Thank you.
Kiri, you have a question back here? Yes, sir. I'm sorry, sir. Right back here.
Thank you, Dr. Kors. I don't know if you are aware that Philadelphia is celebrated in the communist China as a cradle of communism in the United States. And simply because Philadelphia has raised the China flags every year on October 1st, even this year, Mayor declared this China flag years. Anyway, but that's not what I want to emphasize, but I'm so happy to see the Legacy Foundation are doing these events. My question is, what do you think what Communist China is doing to Hong Kong, to its own people in China, the Uyghurs and Falun Gong practitioners and the Christians, and what it is doing to the rest of the world, including the United States? Thank you.
Many, many years ago, during the period of Deng Xiaoping in China, I found myself in an argument with two classical liberal economists arguing that the economic liberalization of China surely meant that it would be followed by the political and cultural liberation of China. And I argued that is not how communists maintain power. At some point, there will be a choice between the maintenance of power on the one hand and the well-being of a population on the other. And they always will choose the maintenance of power. We saw it in Tiananmen Square. I fear we shall see it again in Hong Kong. There's a simple enough rule. I don't think it's ever been wrong. If you're willing to kill enough of your own people, you stay in power. And this regime is more than willing to hold on to its monopoly of power by killing however many it needs to kill. Does that answer your question? Yep.
Amanda, you have a question here. Yes, sir.
It seems that the primary tool of socialist acolytes, communist acolytes today to destroy Western economies is the superstition of anthropogenic global warming, that human activity is leading to the destruction of the planet, and we must invoke all kinds of controls on the population and so forth to make it happen. And it's being bought into, it's a fairy tale, and it's being bought into by politicians on all sides and corporate leaders. And I'm just wondering, is there any hope for us in this?
Well, just think if the socialists had been around when we were coming out of the Ice Age, right? Talk about climate change, which has happened throughout all of recorded history. Yes, that is their weapon. That is the means by which they think they have the young. There was an article in Le Monde in France just 2 days ago about parents terrorized by their school children if they bring home anything with plastic, if they plan a trip that requires a flight. They've gotten the young on that. They control K through 12 education. And that issue of the planet and what they call sustainability is one of the driving wedge issues. The former Václav Klaus, the former magnificent president of Czechoslovakia, gave a talk at a meeting of the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation, in which he said, yes, everything one talks about with the victims of communism is certainly true, but the new communism, the new totalitarianism, is coming from the climate activists, and I think he's absolutely right. You can't have a debate. You can't have an exchange of real scientific experiments and data. It's a rigged system. They won't hire anyone. They won't give a dime of funding to anyone who doesn't buy into the full religion. Yeah, they certainly have gotten the young on that one.
Kira, question back here. Yes, sir.
Yes, Professor, thank you for coming tonight, first of all. And I'm just curious what the reaction of your faculty colleagues is, on campus. And you're not an advocate for a particular position. You're just reciting historical facts, correct?
I've given this talk at universities, and I can see the hostile faculty members and the students they brought along with them. No one will stand up. They won't. Back in their classrooms, who knows what, right? Back in the dorms, who knows what. They will not challenge. They can't.
Do they have any
They
sort
can't.
of objective intellectual discourse with you, or are you shunned, or are you ostracized on campus, or?
I was considered an interesting curiosity.
I have one right here. Karen.
Professor, where do you see the turning point? Where did it begin of this quiet socialism movement that we have in this country, and how did it start here?
The answer, I think, lies in, you mean the current socialist wave, yes. The answer, I think, lies precisely in what I tried to address, namely the failure to educate an entire generation of students in the wake of the triumph of free societies over totalitarian societies about what actually had happened. And in some ways, the disappearance of the mean old Soviet Union made it easier for American socialists. They didn't have to confront it at all. And the past was the past. There were mistakes made. The Russian model's the bad model, right? Everyone assumes that a given moment is a mandate. In 1984, the demographic cohort with which Ronald Reagan did best, highest majority, was 18 through 29. Right? In 1984, Reagan won an overwhelming majority, 60% or more, of the college vote. You can date coercive political correctness from that election. Our left faculty, and they dominate campuses both in numbers. They will only hire people such as themselves, and it may be a majority of people who don't really want to go along with them are afraid to stand up and say anything. At that moment, the kids voted for Reagan. Those kids had to be saved from American society, from their homes, from their parents, from their communities, from their churches. And you can date coercive political correctness from that point on, in my view, and I lived through it. From that point on, let's teach the kids the evils of capitalism. Let's teach the kids the horrors of this society. Let's teach them that they're living in one of the worst places, with one of the worst histories that human beings have ever founded. And not just in the classroom. They might take other courses. Let's get them in the university in loco parentis, in the place of parents. Should be translated crazy parents, right? Loco parentis. But in the place of parents, and let's make them see that they're living in a caste system of unmerited rewards and a system of systemic oppression. And They have not been challenged. They have the ed schools. They have K through 12. And parents do not pass on to their children. This depressed me fiercely at Penn. Parents do not pass on to their children that their family's success has a narrative. It didn't fall down from the skies. It involved work and risk and sacrifice. But kids come in and they're vulnerable. They feel guilty because of their wealth, or they feel guilty because they're at an Ivy League university, or because they're at a university, or now because it's all that they're taught, because they're white, or because they're male, or because they're straight. And we've had K through 12 and the universities now for 3 decades, more than 3 decades, preparing the ground for a left-wing socialist uprising of support among students. And their influence goes to every HR department they go to. It goes to the medias they work for. So it is spreading and metastasizing throughout our society. And people need to fight it. You need to fight it, and you need to educate your children and your grandchildren. Crucial, crucial.
So we have a few of those students back here, and I believe one has a question. Am I right, Kira? We have a question from one of our students.
Thank you, Professor Kors, for that amazing speech on socialism. So I'm going to get straight to the point. Do you believe capitalism comes at the price of creating or accentuating a lower class?
I think human life comes at a price. Did you say, do I think capitalism comes at a price?
Yes.
Could you repeat the question, if you would?
Do you believe capitalism comes at the price of creating or accentuating a lower class?
Everything comes at a price. The price we've paid for capitalism is what's called capitalism. That's Marx's phrase, right? I prefer to talk about societies of voluntary production and voluntary exchange.
Professor, I'm sorry, if you want to use the mic, we have folks back here who can't hear you.
I'm used to a classroom in which my voice is so loud they hear me in the next class. The price historically, writ large, looking at 100,000 years of human history, the price of capitalism, the cost of capitalism, has been the freest societies on the face of the earth, with the lowest infant mortality, the most goods and services available in return for any honest labor, the most social mobility of any human societies in the history of human life on this planet. Everything comes with a cost, right? There are losers, right? It happens in love. Love comes with a cost. There are people we love who don't love us back, right? Capitalism will have people who do better than other people. The bottom 10, 5, 3% of people in a capitalist society live almost infinitely better than human beings have ever lived on planet Earth. There was a study, it turned out that taller men are paid more on average, right, than shorter men, right? It never occurred to me that this injustice should lead me to work for the destruction of the society that has given me such a wonderful life. There are costs to being human, but what we have evolved, and it is a cultural evolution, in markets, the rule of law, due process, freedom of speech, what we have evolved is the best human condition in the history of all life.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you.
Professor Alan Charles Kors. Thank you, Professor. I know there were a lot of questions that couldn't go answered directly by Professor Coors. He may have a few minutes afterwards, but first we'd like our students to come up for a picture, a quick photograph. We hope you'll join us for our January program, which will be with Michael Moreland, moderated discussion. Oh, that's February. January, Rich Lowry from National Review. It'll be a wonderful program. We'll get to you, Michael. Thank you very much.